Welcome to this LinkedIn Live hosted by Marvin Labs. Today's discussion is less about the underlying technology behind AI and more about how commerce itself may evolve as AI becomes a new interaction channel between consumers and brands. A lot of the current debate in AI in commerce is about the technology revolution. However, in reality, many of the underlying mechanisms, such as APIs and structured data, are already familiar parts of digital commerce. What may be changing is the structure of the customer journey, particularly how discovery, interactions, and transaction happen when AI systems sit between the consumer and the merchant. So the discussion today with Zoni and Alex is more around how AI is less of a new technology and more something that is about the potential emergence of another commerce channel, similar to early shifts such as the arrival of web, mobile commerce, and omni-channel retail. To have this discussion today and ask questions from the audience, we have Zoni and Alex. Throughout the discussion, please feel free to type into the comments any questions you'd like us to answer, and the panel will do their best to cover them. Before we begin with the questions and the discussion, let me introduce Zoni and Alex. Zoni, would you like to introduce yourself first? You have a rich background in this topic, and I know absolutely bursting with ideas regarding today's discussion. So welcome, Zoni.
Yes, of course. Thanks, James. So hi, everyone. My name is Zvonimir, and I primarily specialize in strategy innovation. Also, hello from Sydney. It's really great to see so many people joining us from across the globe, and absolute pleasure to be here with you all. And also big thanks to James and Alex for having me. So in the past 12 months, I've extensively looked at how agentic AI is actually changing the way commerce works. So from discovery right through your execution, and then also how all of that comes together from a strategic, operational, and also infrastructure point of view. I think it's genuinely very exciting space where things are evolving almost weekly, if not daily. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today and sharing my thinking and also personal perspectives with everyone here on the call.
That's great. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Alex. I'm the founder and CEO of Marvin Labs. At Marvin Labs, we help professional investors with their due diligence and their research process. I used to be on the investment side. I have to say I never professionally covered retail, but I have a general interest in, as any good investor, hopefully, in any kinds of different industries. So I'm quite excited to learn here, offer a little bit of perspective. My perspective on the whole retail journey is more on the logistics and fulfillment side, where I have a little bit of experience. So I'm excited to learn a little bit from Zoni and from James and see where this discussion takes us today.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I think it's also today, but also going forwards. I mean, Marvin Labs analyzes lots of financial statements, financial reports, especially during earnings season. And I think looking at them recently, you see more and more mentions of AI related to commerce within some of those earnings statements, particularly for the retailers. So I think it's a very topical subject to cover. So let's crack on with the first section, which is about sort of demystifying AI in commerce. There's a lot of misconceptions and confusion out there. I think, Zoni, we have talked about this with yourself previously. So I think a useful place for us to start is simply unpacking the sort of customer journey and separating discovery from transaction execution. And with that, I guess the first question of the day is around what are the biggest misconceptions you see, Zoni, when organizations talk about AI in commerce today?
Thanks, James. I think this is a really, really good one. So I think when people talk about AI commerce, they're often thinking about different parts of that same journey. And I think that one reason this space can sometimes feel very complicated is because you have people who are often talking about different parts of the journey, but actually at the same time. So you have terms flying around. So you might hear something like AI commerce, agentic commerce, AI discovery, AI shopping, you name it. And then sometimes all of these terms feel like if they're all talking about the same thing, when in reality, you would have some conversations which are focusing on your discovery part. Others might focus on transactions and execution. Then you might have others which are primarily focusing on agents or infrastructure. And then once you start separating those pieces, I think the whole ecosystem becomes much easier to understand. And maybe even today for our audience, I can simplify this space a bit more just for a moment so that we can all understand it slightly better. Because I think probably the easiest way to think about it is to separate that entire end-to-end journey, which I see in 4 parts. So your first one is your discovery, which is really all about being visible and showing up inside an AI-generated answer. So this is when a customer asks an AI agent like your ChatGPT or Gemini something like, what are the best running shoes under 200 pounds? And then you have an AI actually generated an answer. So that discovery ultimately is all about being visible and coming up and showing up inside those AI answers. It's almost like you can think about that as an evolution of your search and content strategy, which now many people are referring to as an answer engine optimization. So that's the first part. Then the second part is probably about transaction or execution. And I think this is where the question really becomes, can an AI agent, so your ChatGPT or Gemini, actually complete a purchase? And I think this is the point when AI really needs to connect to your common systems. And ultimately, the question is, can that AI agent complete that purchase on behalf of your customer? And then third piece of that is the actual infrastructure behind the scenes, which is really all about how all these systems actually talk to each other. So this is where things like your APIs, your protocols actually start coming more and more into conversation, because they essentially look at how your AI systems connect to other platforms and ultimately exchange information so that your actions like bookings or shopping can actually happen. And I think it's worth mentioning probably the fourth idea that I think people often discuss, which is the possibility of business agents. And this is ultimately where a company might eventually have its own AI agent, ultimately representing it. So instead of having your main AI agent, like your ChatGPT or Gemini, connecting directly to your merchant system, you would have an agent that could actually interact directly with something like a retail or an airline booking agent, which is ultimately representing your business. And then obviously those types of agents could help you with things like answering questions or checking availability of your products. So I think it's quite important, like once you start separating those pieces, that the entire AI ecosystem actually becomes much easier to understand.
I think that's a really good summary. I think, you touched upon some key points there about discovery, and arguably you could say before that the intent as well, in terms of the actual intent to ask AI for help within that journey. I think for me, one of the big misconceptions is that AI commerce requires new infrastructure. It doesn't. Most of the underlying systems have already been in place for many, many years. What's changing for me, and maybe where the misconception is it's what really changing is how consumers discover products, not necessarily how transactions are processed with a new technology layer. What's your thoughts, Alex, on this question about misconceptions in AI commerce?
Yeah, I think Zvoni made kind of a really, really good effort here, separating the kind of the relevant categories. And I think from an investor's perspective, you then have to kind of think through and get a sense and evaluate where risk factors are for traditional brands, where opportunities lie for additional for existing brands, and where the new emerging technologies might lead to certain shifts in the business model or certain shifts in the market makeup that that will lead to changes in the way business interact. I think for me the big two questions are in Zvoni's kind of first two buckets: discoverability and the execution layer. And I think the big question to me really is, what does it look like for a top-notch business to be prepared in this area? What does it look like for a business not being prepared? I think we've all over the last 10 years seen businesses that completely missed the train on omnichannel. We've seen businesses that completely missed the train on even mobile. And we've seen businesses that exist exclusively because of that. Right? If you think of a Temu business, for example, that exclusively exists because of mobile or social commerce. So I think extrapolating these lessons will be something from the last kind of 2-3 revolutions on in commerce will be an interesting thing, and thinking through kind of what a best-in-class executor needs to actually do to perform well.
I think,
and what they can safely ignore, because I'm reasonably certain there's a lot of stuff in this whole ecosystem that is hot noise, right? Where we might invent something, but it's basically the same as we had before. And as with every technology revolution, right? We'll do certain things way too complicated, and we'll do certain things way too not complicated enough.
Yeah, no, I think you got some good points there. I think just linking that back, Zvoni, to you described some of the steps and the stages within the sort of AI commerce journey. One misconception I hear a lot, which would be good to get your thoughts on, is this whole piece about merchants talking about how to be discoverable within AI in the sort of similar way to SEO in early search. What's your thoughts on that? Because I hear a lot of misconceptions about how to be discoverable. Some pieces I've seen make no sense at all. Others I can see people are carefully looking at, having clean product data, structured catalogs, accessible APIs. What's your take on that? This being discoverable in AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really all about making sure that these AI systems can find, understand, and also trust your information when they generate that answer in front of your customer. So if you have a customer who asks something like, I don't know, what's the best running shoes for long distance training, then obviously the AI needs to identify our own products and businesses with enough confidence to, I suppose, ultimately include them in that response. And I think that confidence ultimately comes from the information it can find across the web. So think about it like your website, your product pages, any review sites, comparison articles, etc. And I think it really helps to take a step back and understand how these AI systems actually work when they're deciding what to include. Because I think it usually comes down to probably 3 things. So I think the first one is accessibility. So can AI actually get to your content in the first place? And I think this is really a technical question, as in, is your website crawlable? Or can an AI agent actually reach your product pages, your descriptions, or any information you might have about your services? Because ultimately, if AI can't physically access your content, it doesn't know you even exist. And I think that's the starting point. And then you move to the next point, which is all about the structure and relevance. So once that AI can actually access your content, then it's all about, can actually make sense of it? Is it actually aligned with how people, how your customers actually ask certain questions? And this is where things like your product schema markup, your structured data become really important. Because they ultimately help AI systems understand your content really quickly and accurately. And then beyond that, your content itself obviously needs to reflect natural conversation type of language that your customers are likely to ask. And then you have that third pillar, which I think is probably one of the most important one, which is all about your authority and credibility of you as a business. Because even if your content can be accessed and it's really, really well structured, the AI still needs to trust you enough to actually recommend you in that AI generated response. And I think that confidence really comes from things like your strong reviews, your thought leadership pieces, and then also you might have some content that is potentially mentioned in some industry publications as well. So ultimately, when you look at that discovery piece, I think you can almost separate these signals into sort of three buckets. One, which is all about, can AI actually find me? The second one, can it actually understand me? And the third one is that related to authority and credibility, as in, can AI actually trust me? Because ultimately, more confident your AI is including you in your answer.
And it's interesting, Zonny, isn't it? It's not that dissimilar to how humans work. You know, we're talking here about AI making those assessments. If you take something like Marvin Labs, which, you know, analysts use to look at sort of industry reports and filings, we're you know, doing the same thing as humans, aren't you? You're looking for maybe something you trust as a source. You're looking at how companies are perhaps discussing AI in their earnings announcements or calls or filings or whatever, and you're making the same judgment, aren't you, about, can I trust this? Do I understand it? Can I access it? What's the thought leadership level here? Alex, what's your thoughts on that? You know, in terms of you know, the structured piece and some of the misconceptions, particularly around, you know, how to be discoverable in AI. And I know Marvin Labs, for example, is targeting and pulling out through the AI agents, you know, how companies are discussing AI in earnings calls.
I think the very interesting question to me is like, because, and I'd be very interested hearing Zvoni's perspective on this, is like, how much of this is just, you know, this is basically the last 10 years of SEO and content marketing. It's like, if you think through kind of what you do in like traditional pre-AI content marketing and SEO, it's very much the same thing, right? It's, you know, do you have machine readable content? Is it accessible? Does it answer the searcher's intent? Is it authoritative? So I think so the big thing for me, and I'm genuinely interested in Zvoni's perspective here, is like, how much of this AI discoverability journey is just amplifying best-in-class SEO content marketing practices that were there before, and the businesses that did that well will excel on the AI discoverability side, and how much of this is, you know, delta new, that, you know, we hadn't, like, pre 2022, we never thought about, you know, this particular thing.
Yeah, what's your thoughts on that, Zonny?
Absolutely. I think it almost comes down to even some of the questions that I've been seeing flying around quite a lot, as in, do I still need SEO, and how does it even relate to AEO? So I think in that respect, I think SEO is obviously not going away, but I think what's important to understand is that these two are very, very closely connected, because they're really working on the sort of same thing, just from slightly different angles. So you can think about it in that way, where you have your SEO, which helps your content ultimately get discovered or indexed across the web. And that's ultimately what makes sure that when obviously someone searches for something, or when an AI system is looking for that information, your content can actually be found. And I think that's been the foundation of that visibility for years, as you rightly mentioned. But then if you look at what AEO actually does, or your answer engine optimization, so again, it's just building on that same foundation, but then instead of just being found in an answer, I think it's all about, again, making sure that your content is structured and written in a way that these AI systems can actually use when they start generating that response. Because I think being discoverable is ultimately one thing, but then being selected as part of that AI generated answer is, in my opinion, another one. And I think that's where really the key shift is, because with SEO, I think the goal has always been to rank as high as possible and release the results. But then if you look with AEO, I think the goal is to be really including directly inside that answer itself. So again, even if you take a step back, you're probably not looking to be competing for a position on a page anymore. But again, ultimately, you as an organization or as a business, you're ultimately competing to be part of that AI generated response. So I think in reality, I think you need both, but they obviously both need to work together. So SEO to make you discovered or indexed, as you like, and then AEO actually making you, well, making you part of that recommendation as part of an AI generated answer.
So my thinking on this is kind of I think there's two sides to this, because I agree with you, right? Like it very much sounds to me like, because in an SEO world, right, you had an n equals 10, which is like your target space, right? You want to be on the first page, but really the difference between being number 3 and being number 9 is, as long as you're not number 1, kind of the difference is getting smaller and smaller. And I think in an AI world where you are now all of a sudden, because the space for you being included in the response is just so much smaller, right? The AI is not going to give you 10 alternatives for like what's the best running shoe below $200. They're going to give you 1 or maybe 2. So I think your target shrinks even more than it from what it was before, which kind of to me would indicate it's it's going to benefit businesses that really have their SEO and discoverability game locked down and really that actually rank number 1 in a lot of things. And I think that the second thing that kind of make this very interesting is because if you think through the last 5 years or so, we've been through this social media revolution of businesses being built on like basically being invisible in the wider web and just being visible and discoverable on social media. Social media is still, by and large, a closed off garden for most of AI systems, right? They are not indexed. Like everything, like fundamentally, what the AI does is right. It runs a web search and it surfaces whatever it gets from that web search in like as its database. So if you're a business that is strong because you have a massive TikTok following and you sell a lot of stuff via that, then kind of I think that might be slightly more difficult to convert into a into being visible in AI, because you're invisible to Google, Bing, and that makes it kind of slightly like, is this kind of a right way of thinking about this, do you think?
I think it's important to actually fully understand how the actually data gets fed into all these systems. I think some of the parts you've already mentioned, they do exist, but I think if we just kind of take a step back and fully understand how that all kind of flows together. So firstly, it's almost like you have your historical data, right? So this is all the information that's been used in order to train some of the models. And depending to what extent of AO you're actually looking to get to, whether it's just like looking at discoverability or you're looking at your shopping execution part as well. Because in that regard, for the shopping purposes, I think that AI systems are likely to actually have a preference to your index data, so that's your SEO. But then the second part of that data ecosystem is pretty much your APIs and products that you can use to feed into these systems. So that's part two. But then you also have the third part, which is ultimately your live website. And again, this is where some of the things that I mentioned earlier actually come into the place, as in, okay, can AI actually get into your content? Can actually start making sense of it? Is it fully structured and optimized in a way AI can actually find it, understand it? And the third part, obviously, it's come to that third part, authority and your credibility piece as well. So also think there are some similarities. I think it's also good to really understand how that mechanism ultimately work. Because what I find really fascinating, I know, James, you're an expert in marketing and SEO, is that even if you look at SEO, like you can use like Google keywords types of tools to actually help you understand what types of keywords your customers might be using. And then you use that in order to do the optimization as needed. But this time, you're actually looking at that AI black box, as I would like to describe, which ultimately you kind of don't actually have the direct answers to the actual questions that your customers might be asking. And this is the part which comes at the very front of your journey. And that's where I think actually this shift is making more interesting, because ultimately we can talk about data, we can talk about our infrastructure, but also we have to understand where does that journey actually starts. As in, okay, what types of questions are our customers likely to ask? But then I find it extremely fascinating. It's all about, okay, how do I even understand, or how can I increase my chances or actually probability of understanding what these types of questions are actually being asked, in order so that I can start my journey from, okay, how do I optimize my discovery piece, and then make certain decisions as to what extent and how they actually want to appear in that execution transaction layer. But I can also talk about some of that later if needed as well, in particular about how to even think about these questions.
I think they're good. That's a good point when you talk about questions. Matt Peacock, I think, related to much of what we've been talking about so far, has asked two questions actually. So thanks, Matt. Two for the price of one's good as well. So his first question is, if the data lake is the core moat for platforms, what is preventing hyperscalers from acquiring and consolidating the best, most data-rich platforms, thus removing the need for API feeds similar to the Google search model? And also, secondly, is asked, how do we think about platforms' monetization models, which historically have been built around ads? And that's a very good point about ads. And how does the monetization model change? And will these result in wider disparities between closed and open ecosystem business models? Now, there's two questions there, Zvonimir. Maybe we take the first one and then think through the second one after that. The bit about the hyperscalers first. I'd be quite interested to get your thoughts on that.
I think that's certainly an interesting point to be made, because again, at the same time, we've got a lot happening in that space, as in it's evolving. And I think you are kind of really right to connect the two things together, because I think they are quite closely linked. So on your data side, I think there's, in my personal opinion, there's actually very little that's preventing all these platforms from building exactly that kind of advantage. because you can think about what they're actually capturing. So every time a customer actually asks an AI agent a question, that's your intent data. But what people are looking for is what it is they're comparing. So what criteria actually matters to them, and then ultimately what they end up buying. And I think that's probably arguably the most valuable piece of information that potentially traditional search ever captured, because it's ultimately a full conversation and not just a keyword. So I think that platforms that are pretty much powering these AI interactions are sitting on that valuable layer of customer insight. And I think that's exactly the same dynamic we saw with Google search as well. So ultimately, the more people use it, I think the better the data that gets. And then the harder it actually becomes for anyone else to complete. So yes, I think that that data is very real and it's already being built. And then maybe to touch upon that monetization piece, because I think that's where we're seeing a shift from, you can describe it almost like an attention-based model to a transaction-based model, because I think historically your platforms made money by selling ads. But then there is an entire topic we can even open up and discuss in terms of the ads actually starting to kick in as part of your AI agent. So what's been happening recently, like even in, I mean, OpenAI has started testing the outlets. A few weeks ago, you also have Google actually starting the experimentation with their what they call direct offers. So again, I think it's a lot to be definitely uncovered and think through, but then we'll just see how that actually entire space evolves, because it's changing day in, day out.
What's your thoughts, Alex, on those two questions about the data lake and the monetization model?
Yeah, it's. I think it's. This is probably where my domain expertise kind of stops a little bit, because it feels like this is something that is. I think it's easy to undersell how good the current intent-based model actually is. Right, we are 20 years into this. We have like massively detailed, sophisticated contribution models on all the analytics tools. Because I think while all the data capture that is happening in the pre-AI model is a little bit spotty, a little bit tricky, right? It's still, if you're a brand and you're running this professionally and you know what you're doing, you're still having an immense sense of how people discover you, what you can do to optimize it, because we have 20 years experience of doing this. Because SEO is not new technology, because all the analytics have been established. People have done research on this. So I think it's easy to undersell how much we know in the current model, and I think it's likewise it's easy to overstate how much data we are at least currently getting out of the new model. So that to me is kind of always the big thing on that side. It's I'm kind of very much a believer that we actually have pretty good insights right now, and probably the quantum leap we do in insight quality is not going to be massive. But Zvoni, very interested in hearing your perspective on this.
I think this is a really good point, which kind of makes me think about who ultimately owns your customer relationship in that space. Because traditionally, if you look at the business ultimately own their relationship with your customers. So your customer came to a website, browsed your products, looked at other options, and then ultimately completed their purchase. And then if you look at their journey, you can ultimately see that what they were doing, maybe why they're doing, because you had some of the cost. Well, I mean, you do have like custom behavior analytics, which actually help you start building that relationship over the time. But I think what's quite fascinating here is almost like when you have that AI agent who becomes ultimately part of their journey, you have that dynamics slightly starting to drift or shift, because that ultimate conversation now starts happening between that customer and your AI agent, where ultimately the AI agent might actually be sitting on that golden piece of information, which might never actually get passed on to you if you start looking at your execution and transaction layer as well. So then again, I think even if you take a step back and start understanding what happens throughout the journey, it's almost like, okay, but who's owning that relationship? Because potentially, like in my view,
Yeah,
I think that.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that basically I just think that it's going to be shared ultimately between your AI agents and platforms and the business. But then the question still remains almost like, okay, but how do you as a business remain actually part of that conversation? And that's where obviously you might consider some of the options like building your own agent representing you as a company in order to start and gathering or actually getting a slightly more pieces of information about your customers than you would do if you were not going to take that route.
I think the question to me in this is that, like, how much is that different than, because if I want to buy a running shoe, I'm not buying running shoes, as you can tell by my face. But if I were to buy running shoes, like, I'm not necessarily buy them on the website of the running shoe manufacturer, right? I might buy them on an e-commerce aggregator like an Amazon. I might buy them on Amazon's or on the brand's TikTok store. I might buy them in either branded or a multi-brand storefront, right? So it's not like my running shoe. It's not like I'm the only way to buy a running shoe is going to the website of the manufacturer, right? So, and I think, and my question really is always with this is like, how much of this, now I have the agent there as well, right? And that's kind of completely understand, right? That's a new part. That's something you need to think through. But how much is that different than, Amazon injecting itself in the journey because I'm buying the running shoe on Amazon, or Marks and Spencer's injecting itself into the discussion because I go into my local Marks and Spencer's and buy the running shoe.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting one that I just get your thoughts on this, Sonny, as well, is obviously when we talk about something like like a running shoe, as you say, that's one thing. But if I think myself about, say, car insurance or home insurance, and how those markets with aggregators, which are price comparison websites and all of this type of thing, how that might change over time. That it's one thing to look at maybe one trainer that's available in multiple locations. It's another thing to turn it round on its head and say, my car insurance renewal's up. There's a multi-million price comparison industry around car insurance and quotes and providers providing similar cover. How that might surface in terms of discovery when I have an intent to go to an AI engine to go and help me with that journey. I'm really curious to see how that will change. What's your thoughts on that sort of space, Sonny? The trainer or the individual item is one thing, but maybe a financial services type product is another.
I think there are two parts to that question, and ultimately I think for businesses, one part of that could be thinking about what is your actual channel strategy, but I can talk about it slightly later. But to specifically address your point, I think it's really interesting place to see where that comparison has already been part of your customer journey. So again, if you look at running shoes or car insurance, I think today a lot of customers already go to your comparison websites to look at number of different options side by side. So you have them, they will check their price, reviews, product availability, etc. But then what AI agents do is essentially it's almost aggregating that comparison step into that single interaction and bring that up in front of a customer. So then again, instead of the customer visiting several comparison sites or retail websites, I think that AI can ultimately look across all those types of sources and then ultimately, to a certain extent, do some of the work on their behalf. But then I think what is quite interesting to see in that space is almost like where do you differentiate as a business in that entire space? And this is where I think when you look at these signals that AI is ultimately looking for, this is where ultimately it comes down to your data quality, your price, your speed of delivery. Because ultimately, if you start thinking about, okay, how can I even differentiate myself in that competitive market? We already know that these are some of the key signals that AI is looking for. But now if you take a step back from that entire discovery piece, I think what is quite interesting to see, even if you start looking at some of the sources that AI is actually using at this stage to actually pull the information from, I think that, again, because of the way AI systems actually work, it's quite similar to how some of these third-party aggregator sites have already been built to a certain extent. So then even like a simple experiment that you can do, it's almost like, okay, trying to ask some questions and put that into your AI agent interface, and then really look for types of sources that where this information is coming from. And then sometimes, especially because we are still at early stages of actually understanding these feasibility part and execution part, you are likely to see again if the majority of these sources are actually coming from a third-party sites, from your aggregated sites as well. But also you can use that as your insight to actually have a think about, okay, that clearly potentially gives a signal that I might not be the right sort of authority or credibility for AI in order to actually consider any of the content that sits on my website, or actually that could make me think about things like, okay, what I need to think about, where do I want to focus on in terms of my content, as in what I can own in terms of my website, product feeds, APIs, etc., versus what some of the third parties are actually talking about me as a brand, in order to again start understanding how the AI systems work, and ultimately, I think, position myself rather well in these types of AI generated answers.
Yeah, I mean that's really good. I think it's a really interesting topic. I think we could talk for a while on this. I think I mean I do want to come to some of the friction points, but if I took the example like we were just saying there about take an insurance product, motor or home or that type of thing, which millions of people around the world use. You know, today you've got a situation where an insurer could have very poor claims ratio, high complaint numbers, very poor content that's misleading, but it will paper over it all with glossy marketing, television ads, and maybe paid ads, you know, in terms of pushing past things. It's going to be really interesting to see, back to your earlier, you know, point about the AI looking at, say, thought leadership, consistency, surfacing someone, discovering them. It will discover the poor claims ratio. It will discover the high complaint numbers, whereas maybe a consumer doesn't see that today because they're getting papered over with glossy marketing, TV ads and paid ads. I mean, for me, that's one of the interesting shifts, is how the discovery will call out problems more, not just fall into the same trap that some of the marketing has today, which is it papers over all the problems and creates that magic word brand image as opposed to authoritative reality. But I do want to touch upon some of the friction points. We've got just 15 minutes left in the event, and we talked a lot about how merchants and the sort of discovery phase come together. But I'm curious about your thoughts, both of you, around where some of the friction points are, between AI and e-commerce models, and where you see that being. So I'll come to you first, Sonny, because I think it'd be good in the last quarter to sort of dip into where are some of the biggest friction points, whether it be control of product discovery, or what does it mean for advertising, that type of stuff.
Absolutely. No, happy to take on this one. I think that here we are really seeing a few shifts here. So I think the first one is obviously all about how your customers discover products, because even in the past, historically, like, businesses focus heavily on driving your traffic primarily to their own website with, as you rightly mentioned, video search and advertising. But now you have that discovery part, which actually start happening inside your AI agent interface. And then ultimately, that customer journey basically starts and potentially ends inside the AI agent interface itself without a customer actually never even going anywhere else. So I think that kind of means more on the focus where it shifts from simply, again, tracking traffic to actually being included in your AI generated recommendations. And I think probably the second one is around how all these products are actually presented in front of the customer. Because if you look at traditional e-commerce, like, businesses would primarily design the entire experience. So your product page, your messaging, any comparison, checkout flows, everything would be designed to make sure that ultimately it aligns with your overarching customer experience. But now with AI agents coming into place, I think you have that entire information, which is simply summarized and just shown inside our AI response. So I think businesses here really need to think carefully about the information that already exists about them across the web, just like you rightly used your example earlier, James. And I think this again comes back to your accessibility of the content optimization, and also that authority and credibility, because that's ultimately what the AI is using to form an answer. And probably the third sort of area, which I think is quite interesting that we briefly spoke about earlier, is your customer relationships and data. Because I think in traditional e-commerce, the business ultimately owns that interaction with their customers. So again, you know who they are, you can see what they're doing, you can build that relationship over the time. But then more and more of that journey actually happens inside that AI agent. That AI agent making that conversation happen ultimately also becomes part of that customer relationship. And I think in many cases, the business may only see just the end result of that interaction. But again, without actually having any sort of context around how, or even maybe about why the customer picked them as a business, which is also some of the things we talked about earlier. And I think it naturally kind of leads to a bigger question in terms of, okay, who ultimately kind of owns that customer relationship in this environment, which I think is something that industry is really starting to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point about who owns the relationship, depending on where the transaction takes place. And then even aside from the softer sort of customer relationship, customer service angle, the legality of the transaction and who owns that transaction, or a refund, you return your trainers because they didn't fit, how does that process work legally and financially? Alex, the thoughts around execution as well. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this to me is really the fascinating thing and this is probably the one that also people got. Some people kind of got horribly burned in when they implemented mobile, when they implemented omnichannel, right? So it's all about how do you make sure that you're not, well, how do you get comfortable as a business to lose some of that ownership? Are you getting comfortable with it? And are you getting comfortable with your customer eventually concluding their purchase in an AI system? I think there's a lot of analog in a customer concluding their purchase on an e-commerce aggregator, on an Amazon. But I think it'll be interesting to see a kind of like, how does this work technically? But I think that's for most brands, that's the less interesting thing. And how does this fit in your pre-existing channel strategy, which has for whatever reasons kind of a particular markup. So I think that's the other dimension, and I think it's a dimension where lots of businesses have to decide how they want to approach it, and if it fits their channel strategy, if it doesn't fit their channel strategy, and how they want to position themselves. I'm interested in hearing Zvonim's perspective on this.
Absolutely, no, happy to take on that one, because I think we really need to take a step back and really consider about, or think about what does that actually all mean for a company's channel strategy? Because again, as you rightly said, so maybe over the last 20 years or so, you've got businesses who build their channel strategies around your things like your website, your mobile apps, etc. And then each of these sort of became a place where a customer could ultimately discover your products and then eventually make your purchase. And I think what's happening right now is that, again, you have AI, which is ultimately becoming one of those similar types of movements in terms of the channels, because it's ultimately becoming a new channel where your customer can do all of that. So I think the question for businesses really becomes, as in, to what extent do we as a business actually want to then participate in this channel? And also, I think we also have to consider how much do we actually want AI to be part of how we actually reach our customers? Because you could take more, I think you can take more of that sort of direct approach, where I think you can focus completely on driving customers to your own environment. So your website, your apps, your experience that you ultimately control. Or I think you can go a bit more further, I suppose, and take more of a I can almost call it full distribution approach, where you are saying, okay, we really want AI agents to recommend us, but we also want our customers to be able to shop and purchase from us right there inside that AI conversation. And what I really think where most businesses could potentially end up is somewhere in between. So again, maybe participating in both, but then also deciding to what extent they want to prioritize each of these sort of strategies. But I think the really important thing here is that this also needs to sit within your overall channel strategy, because it has to be a strategic decision and not just like a separate experiment which might be happening on the side. Yes, fine, you can start with that, but then again, I still think that it comes down to your overall channel strategy, because I think that businesses that start treating that AI just as another pilot project, they might end up actually in that sort of risk, and they might find themselves actually participating on someone else's terms as part of that entire journey, rather than actually fully understanding what it is that we want to own, how do we want to actually show up, and how do we actually want to shape up that entire end-to-end journey for our customers ultimately.
I think just we've got 5 minutes left. I'm just building on that, Zvoni, and I'll come to you, Alex, just for sort of closing thoughts here about what's the big call out for the next 12 months? You know, we can talk a lot about how things will change over a medium term, but from your perspective, what if you were a company, and I can see many are on this live event, what's the big one thing you'd call out to them for the next 12 months? Zvoni, what would that be for you?
So for me, I think I would absolutely love to encourage everyone to pay attention to, I think, the fundamental shift in how actually customer loyalty works. Because I think traditionally loyalty has been pretty much based on emotions. So it's something you would build over time with your customer experience, with your trust, when you ultimately have that direct relation with your customer. But what I think we're seeing right now is that shift towards what I would describe as algorithmic loyalty. So ultimately, where you have AI systems which are assessing your business based on those signals we talked about, so your quality of data, your pricing, your reviews, etc. And those signals potentially be seen as starting to influence which businesses actually end up being recommended to customers and ultimately show up in that AI generated answer. And I think what it means is that ultimate loyalty is not just about the relationship that you have with your customers, but it's also about how your business performs against those signals that ultimately AI is using to make certain decisions. Because I think the question really is no longer just about whether customers really love our brand, but it could also be seen as, does AI understand our business well enough to actually recommend us? Or in other words, does AI love us as a brand?
Good point. Alex?
Yeah, I think like my focus would be, I completely appreciate Zvoni's focus. My focus, I think, would be a little more on the execution part and the channel strategy part. I think as a business, you either make a decision that this is not for you, that you want to continue owning the journey, but then you probably don't have an aggregator strategy anyways. But if you make a conscious decision, right, this is not for you. You wanna maybe get people to your website and to your own e-commerce experience, to your own app. That's fine. I think that's a valid decision that businesses make if they do it strategically. But don't make this decision because it seems daunting to you, or because you don't believe that this is a new channel. Right? If you make this decision, then make this decision purely based on this doesn't fit your brand. And if you made the decision that this might be something for you, just make sure that your systems can handle it. Most likely they can already, because I hope that in 12 months' time we're in a world where the agent making the purchase decision is going to be fundamentally, from your perspective as a brand, it's going to look the same as if somebody buys it on Amazon. Right? You have the right data, you have the right APIs, you have the right systems in place and everything. You have the right inventory information, but fundamentally, you don't care if somebody, from a technical perspective, you don't care if somebody buys it on Amazon or if somebody buys it on ChatGPT. And then just be ready for that. Be open to run the experiments and make the experience work. But if you can foresee yourself ever engaging this, just make sure your systems can handle it. And that to me would be is I think the big thing over the next 12 months. Don't be left out of this because you can't do it. And I think in mobile and omnichannel, both kind of fundamentally, I feel technically way more challenging. That was a thing for brands, right? Brands were left out of this experience of the growth because they couldn't do it. They didn't do the investment to be ready. And I don't think you want to be on the same side again in AI.
No, I think that's that's very good. I think both of you made very good points about the next 12 months. I'll close just with some thoughts, perhaps slightly different angle around analysts who are looking, especially at the commerce sector. I think that the next 12 months for them will be maybe more looking for the signals about where transactions are happening and how companies are talking about AI and commerce, and particularly, I guess to some extent, early signals of sort of how the channels, as you mentioned, Zoni, are evolving across retail and e-commerce companies when it comes to looking at the future. So I think for analysts, I think it's where the transaction's happening and how people are talking about it within the firms will be something to really zoom in on much more over the next 12 months than previously the last 12 or 24. But that's been a really fascinating conversation and very insightful. The hour, as usual, has absolutely raced by. I can see the audience has remained with us throughout. So thank you, Zoni. Thank you, Alex, for some terrific insights there. And thank you to the audience who have asked a couple of questions as well. And Matt Peacock, perfect on timing, bang on at 10 o'clock. You said, great discussion. Thanks so much for the insights. I think that's the perfect way to wrap this up. Thank you to everybody, and speak to see you soon on another Marvin Labs LinkedIn live event.